So for our first lecture in Oklahoma history, we're going to combine several different things and we are going to cover a tremendous amount of history. So one of the things that I want you to keep track of in your notes as you're taking notes is the timeline here. So we are going to go essentially from uh, ancient history all the way up through several centuries worth of history because I want us to sort of speed up through European colonizations into American conquest. So you're going to see a lot of essentially fast forwarding. The other thing that I want you to be mindful of is that throughout this particular lecture, you're going to see me refer to, or you're going to see the presentation refer to Oklahoma in quotes, primarily because I want you to understand what we're talking about, but I also want you to be mindful of the fact that Oklahoma is not assigned is not the name assigned to this area. In fact, this area is not even specifically you know, identified in any kind of way. It's a part of a larger region. It's a part of a larger territory. And so, if anything, we are talking about areas that are occupied by different peoples, different groups, different civilizations and cultures. And so those boundaries haven't been identified yet. Those territories haven't been identified yet. And so when I talk about Oklahoma in that sense, I am very broadly using that term just so you have an idea of what we're getting into. Another warning that I want to issue is there are going to be a lot of maps, not just in this lecture, but in every lecture, because it is important for you to know what we're talking about and the region that we're talking about as well. Not just within Oklahoma, whether we're talking about pre-statehood or post-statehood, but it's also important that you understand what we're talking about within the boundaries of the country as well. So while I'm not having you take a test where you identify counties or anything like that, it is important that you understand geographically where we're talking about, what we're talking about, and that you understand what we're talking about in terms of treaties and that sort of thing. Because there is a lot happening in terms of land exchanges, particularly over the course of several decades and even centuries. So that's important to keep in mind. So that's essentially a warning that I'm giving to you. So in this particular lecture going over explorers and rivalries, I want to sort of set this up by talking about the ancient communities of this area, starting with big game hunters, which goes back, if you look at archaeological studies, actually the earliest date of evidence shows that it goes back actually roughly around 11,000 years ago. There is evidence of life going back 11,000 years ago in Caddo County. And what you'll notice is from that evidence, most of the people who had lived in Caddo County were actually big game hunters. But big game hunters eventually would die off, and their descendants were foragers. So they hunted still, but they weren't big game hunters. Instead, what they did was they had evolved in their taste, they had evolved in their way of life, and had learned to live off of the land. And in addition to being hunters, they had also developed certain styles of farming, which in terms of farming, one of the things that, if you ever get into early Native American history, one of the things you'll learn about is the fascinating development of maize. And maize has its earliest appearance in central Mexico about 5000 BCE, and it revolutionizes Native American history, but it also sort of follows the people through basically this whole idea of travel and trade. So it doesn't stay in central Mexico, right? It goes all the way up through North American societies and Native American civilizations throughout North America and South America. And it reaches the foraging civilizations here in present day Oklahoma. And so agriculture becomes a really big deal. So agriculture takes place in small fields around rivers and creeks, which would lead to the creation of housing nearby, and it helps to sort of maintain this hunting, gathering lifestyle of the past. And for those of you who have already taken world history, or you're taking world history, hopefully you've learned this, but if not, one of the things that you should be mindful of, or hopefully this reminds you of, is that this is indicative of what happens in early human societies all throughout Africa, when there are early civilizations and archaeologists find these signs of early civilizations there as well. One of the things that you have to keep in mind with these signs and with these discoveries is that rivers help to sort of establish these stable societies, right? Where you know where there is water, there is life, and you can depend on these sources of life for stable sources of food. And that allows for these small groups of communities to be able to create themselves. These communities also are able to create not only their own sort of agricultural centers with their own economies, but they also create their own cultural lives outside of their economic subsistence. And that would include pottery. Pottery had a twofold purpose. One, there's a practical purpose, right? The practical purpose is it helped to prepare and store food. It was used, obviously, to help carry water. But then there's the creative purpose. Pottery was also about art. And this is what a lot of students, and it's not just students, it's a lot of people have a really hard time understanding, and that is this innate human need to create. But the reality is that for all human beings, regardless of whether or not you feel like you're an artist, there is this natural tendency to want to create something, whether it's doodling in your notebook or actually painting something or making music, writing poetry, whatever. That's always been in existence in human beings, as indicated in these anthropological and archaeological studies, and that's what's happening here. And so pottery served, as indicated in this photograph, pottery served as not only a practical purpose, but as a form of expression. And that's why these ancient communities are so important. And so from that point on, around AD 900, we get to the golden age of prehistory. And that's where you see the real sort of creation and development of real solid communities that you can see, not just these small signs of culture and civilization, but this is real development of civilizations and cultural communities that not only existed with each other but also had communities that had independence, but relationships with other communities as well. So I want to start with Western present day Oklahoma, what would be present day Oklahoma, where you had the existence of Plains Village farmers. So Plains Village farmers traded with people who lived in other communities. We know this because of the kinds of things discovered within Plains Village farmers. They tended to have things that wouldn't typically belong to them. And then you would also see things indicative of the Plains Village farmers with groups or communities in different areas of North America, indicating strong trading networks. Plains Village farmers also were known to be more effective hunters because they used the bow and arrow. So if you look at the image here on the right, let me see if I can use my little pen here. So if you look at this image on the right, you'll notice that he is developing, or this image is developing, sharp weapons here, little arrowheads, that sort of thing. So this is how these are the types of things they used for hunting, but this is not just for smaller animals. This was also for primarily bison hunting. That's the main purpose for what they were trying to do. Around 1400 AD, what the Plains Village farmers go through is a severe crop failure due to a drier climate. And so it forces them to rely entirely on hunting, because prior to that, they were hunters, but they were also farmers. Hunting entirely rather than only farming would completely change their culture, their identity, and it's going to be something that we see continues on for literally generations and centuries. Something that we see will carry on into well into the 20th, into the 19th century, excuse me. And we'll talk about that later on as we get into American conquest of the West, and we get into all of the treaties and the violence to come. But this is where that significant change in culture and Western native identity comes. Because of climate change, and it forces them to stop relying on the land. It forces them to become hunters. When it forces them to become hunters, they completely rely on the bison to develop their identity, to develop their religious beliefs, develop their whole cultural system. That changes everything. So put a big asterisk by that, or a star by that, highlight it in your notes. Remember that for what's to come in the future. Now, on the eastern side of Oklahoma, you have mound builders. And for those of you who have been on the eastern side of the state, you might be familiar with the spiral mounds, or the spiro mounds, as some of you might call it. The mounds were foundations for temples, but not just temples. Some of them are used for public buildings or chief homes, burial sites for wealthy leaders. So, what we're mostly familiar with are the Caddoan mounds, and these are essentially structures that are complicated. They are indicative of a society that is thinking of structures that are complex and going to involve multiple needs and multiple functions, but it's also sort of linked to structures that are similar to structures like what takes place or what is created in Central and South America. These are people who tended to live near streams and rivers. Eastern Oklahoman tribes were traders and farmers, hunters and artisans. They are very religious, and their jewelry tended to express their faith. And the reason why I get into all of this is because I want you to understand that all of these people, regardless of where they live, are people who have their own identities, people who have their own religious beliefs, people who have their own societies, right? And in fact, it only evolves from there, right? So when we talk about the first peoples, and we'll get into that in a minute, the reason why sometimes they're known as the first people. These are the Wichita and affiliated tribes, the Apache, the Comanche, and the Osage. Um, the Wichita and the affiliated tribes are people who, these people are people who successfully established economies based on farming, hunting, gathering, and commerce. And one of the things that the Wichita were able to do, along with these affiliated tribes of the Apache, Comanche, and Osage, was that they were able to establish fortified towns with unique architecture. You can see that architecture in these images on the left side of the screen, with these houses, these homes essentially made of grass. They were people who lived essentially in Anadarko, in Caddo County. They lived primarily as farmers, but they also hunted. They raised corn, beans, squash, gourds, also tobacco. But in terms of hunting, they hunted buffalo because buffalo were the primary animal of the plains. I mean, that's what you would hunt, and that's what was the most valuable. But what made them the most dominant people of that area, of that particular region, and the reason why they're known as the first peoples, is that they successfully traded the meat and the skins of the buffalo and coordinated trade in that area. Essentially, they dominated trade. And eventually, especially after the Europeans would come in, they would be the most successful and in terms of coordinating trade in that area, and eventually would trade in the skins and meat for guns and horses. And we'll talk about why guns and horses are going to be so problematic later on. But when we talk about the importance of trade, and when we talk about the importance of the Wichita and the affiliated tribes, these are going to be the first peoples in terms of who outsiders were going to have to deal with, right? So if you were someone who was outside of the region, like for example, the French, who only wanted to be there for trade, the French understood that if they wanted to do any business in the region, they had to deal with the Wichita and the affiliated tribes. That's what made them the first peoples. So let's talk about how their societies were set up. So society was matrilineal. Their relationships were traced through women. Their properties were assigned through the oldest married woman of the family. So if it was the grandmother if the grandmother or great grandmother was still living, all of the property had belonged to her, and she would be the one who essentially divided it, decided who took what. Once she was gone, the next oldest woman took over. So if she had a daughter, then the daughter would take over from that. Extended family lived in the home. So it's very much family oriented, and that leads me to kinship. Kinship, which is also known as clan, it's on the basis of wider association. You are this whole idea of being uh, known or being connected to other families is important. You want to have alliances, you want to have kinship with others. But here's the thing, members of the same clan were forbidden to marry. So that was something that you did have to be aware of. The Wichita and affiliated tribes, in terms of government, while their societies were matrilineal, men held the power politically. And politically, their government was run by a chief and a sub-chief. So we would say president and vice president, they have a chief and a sub-chief. Now, keep this in mind, the men who held political power were selected by the women. So the women who led the families chose the men who represented them in the government. So the men often went to the women, went to their grandmothers or the women who led their families, and the women would tell them how to vote, what to say, and voted accordingly. The religion of these first peoples was primarily the corn dance. So the corn crop ripened in the summer, obviously. And so during the summer, as the corn ripened, they considered that a time of purification for both your bodies and a time of purification of your homes. And so essentially, you saw this time of harvest as you're syncing yourself with nature, and you would purify yourself with that. So it was, and the cleansing is timed with that sort of festival, right? The whole idea is it's purification. You're starting all over again. So as soon as you plant new seeds, you yourself are renewed and you yourself are starting all over again. Now, in terms of the idea of war was not ever about conquest. It was not about going against another tribe, a rival tribe, and conquering them or stealing their stuff, just for the sake of stealing. It was not about power to gain what they had. It was always about revenge. And it was about honor. So say, for example, if another tribe had what you believe, if another tribe had wrongfully taken from you or wrongfully killed one of your tribe members, then you would kill one of their tribe members. Or if they took from you unfairly in a trade, then that would be a reason for war. It was never about selfish gain. That was the whole point. There was a sense of righteousness that they had behind the whole idea of war. Now, what's going to change that, of course, is exposure to Europeans, because Europeans are going to introduce new things that would increase their status, increase native status. And those two things, of course, are going to be horses and guns. Horses are going to change how native people hunt. It'll make it easier for them to hunt. It'll make it easier for them to fight. And so will guns. Guns will make it easier for them to fight and win. It'll make it easier for them to hunt buffalo. Horses will also be a source of status, right? Horses in particular. And guns would be introduced to them thanks to the French in particular. So I want to, on that note, talk about the influence of these Europeans and why they have such a different impact on native peoples. Let's start with Spain. So Spain, when they come into the Western Hemisphere in general, in the 14th, 15th century, Spain is motivated by gold. And they are convinced that there is a tremendous amount of gold to be discovered here, but they discover a lot more, right? They discover gold, they also discover silver, they make a tremendous amount of profit off of sugar. And then, of course, they come with the blessings of the Catholic Church. And one of the things that I think is worth your consideration are these individuals who will who are going to make a particular difference with Oklahoma. I want to start with Francisco Coronado, who is this individual here. So Francisco Coronado, there we go. That's quite the marker. Francisco Coronado is an explorer who was heavily motivated by gold. He wants nothing more than to discover gold. And Coronado is coming with the blessings of the Catholic Church, coming with the blessings of the Spanish royalty. But because he has the blessings of the Catholic Church, that means he's also got to come with the Catholic, come with a Catholic priest. And he comes with a chaplain named Friar Juan de Padilla. That actually should be an A at the end, not an O. I'm sorry, my apologies. So it's Juan de Padilla, Padilla, not O. So if I were to get my little pen here, I would make that an A. So let's see if I can actually do that. Let's see. There you go. That's an A. There it is. So that would be this gentleman right here. So Juan de Padilla is the chaplain who comes with him. So Coronado actually makes it into North America. He's the guy who's going to make it into present-day New Mexico, looking for gold, constantly looking for gold. And he is the one explorer who gets into Oklahoma and is frustrated because he's not finding any gold. And Juan de Padilla is a chaplain who is just like, okay, this guy is crazy. This guy, meaning Coronado, is crazy because all he cares about is gold. I'm trying to save people because obviously that's my purpose here. And Padilla is convinced that all he needs to do is talk to native peoples and he can just save everybody's souls. So everywhere Coronado goes, de Padilla is establishing Catholic missions. And these Catholic missions tend to be problematic because the Catholic missions kidnap these native peoples and put them to work. And so the de Padilla goes into Oklahoma, present-day Oklahoma, and makes it all the way to where the Wichita and affiliated tribes are, and he's killed. And so it doesn't turn out well for de Padilla when we talk about his experience here. But that leads me to our next contestant, Juan de Oñate. So de Oñate, who of course is this guy, our last contestant here. So de Oñate is the man who was set up as the governor of the New Mexican colony. His trip would take him to the western border of Oklahoma. And he and his men look around and basically say the same thing that others would say, and that is, There's no gold here. If there's no gold, as others would say, if there's no gold, then this is no good. It's a waste of our time, and the lands are essentially useless. Um, but then what ends up happening is they will push themselves to meet with the Wichitas, and that's the key. When the Spanish hear about the Wichitas and the Wichita and the affiliated tribes, they realize that there's a lot of potential here of profit. And there is a significance there because Spain could claim dominion over the entire area west of the Mississippi Valley. That's what they're thinking. And so, as a result, what ends up happening is while Spain decides not to fight the Wichita and their allies and the affiliated tribes, what they decide to do is instead establish an alliance with the Wichita, which is really smart on their part, because what the Spanish usually do is they try to enslave native peoples, and they're usually really successful at that. But what they cannot do with the Wichita and the affiliated tribes is enslave them, because the Wichita and the affiliated tribes are large, powerful, wealthy. They know what they're doing. They have established themselves. They are not easily dominated. And the Spanish, and Oñate in particular, he just doesn't have that many men. He doesn't have that much money. He can't do that. So instead, they establish an alliance, and that is to his benefit. So what he does instead is he establishes an important alliance. Now, what that leads us to is France. Now, France begins their exploration of the Western Hemisphere in the early 17th century, right? And by 1682, the Mississippi River and the lands west of the Mississippi River were claimed for France and named Louisiana. There had been a series of treaties and issues going on with Spain. So I'm going to just say, going back, let me go back for a second. If we go back to, let me go back. Oh, it won't let me go back. Okay, so if we go back to thinking about Spain, when we think about how Coronado and all of them show up and meet with the Wichitas, it works for a while. But then one of the things you've got to keep in mind, remember this from your early U.S. history days, or even world history days, I'm sorry, Spain goes bankrupt a few times because King Philippe has no idea what he's doing and bankrupts them. And so France takes advantage of that and ends up purchasing much of those lands. So France, when they show up here in the Western Hemisphere, their entire focus is trade. That's all they want. They don't want to conquer the land. They want trade, because for them, there is all of this potential in profit, and that's all they care about. So for them, they want to focus on a series of settlements and military posts all along the Mississippi River. One of the things that you need to understand about the United States is that one of the great advantages that the United States has geographically is the Mississippi River. And a lot of people don't think about that. So if you ever, and in fact, I encourage you to do this, Google a map of the United States and take a look at the Mississippi River. Take a look at, first of all, how huge it is. The fact that it extends from the Gulf of Mexico all the way north, and all of its tributaries, and how far east and west those tributaries go. It's huge and it's incredibly important. And so the French want to take advantage of the Mississippi River and establish a series of settlements and military posts all up and down that river, right? And what they're hoping to do is, in particular, establish some sort of relationship with Spain, um, in terms of the southern part of the Mississippi River region, particularly along the Rio Grande, right? So if you're thinking about where the Rio Grande is, we're talking specifically right by Texas, right? So right along that southern border of Texas. So right on that Rio Grande area, that's where France wants to start establishing a strong trade relationship with Spain, but they want to dominate that region right there. Now, the the whole idea of trade, is going to be really important because their success, France's success, really depended on how well the tribes in Oklahoma were getting along with each other, right? So France decides to send in their negotiators, their explorers, to negotiate with the tribes and establish good relations with everybody to make sure that the tribes are getting along with each other, and most importantly, everybody knows what their jobs are, what their responsibilities are. Now, that said, if you compare France to Spain, France immediately sees the value in Oklahoma. They see Oklahoma as a very dangerous, but a very valuable possible route straight into Santa Fe. So in other words, think of them this way. They see Oklahoma as the early version of I-40, right? They see this as, okay, we can cut across Oklahoma, and go straight into Santa Fe. Now, there are a lot of risks here. And the reason why it's risky is because of all of the different tribes along the way. If you don't establish a friendly relationship early on, you're in big trouble. That's why this is important. The second reason why, or the second reason why they're different from Spain is that they saw Native Americans as potential partners in commerce as opposed to competitors, or as opposed to uh, employees, or even worse, which is what Spain did, as opposed to slaves, right? Because the Spanish enslaved Native people. The French did not. The French saw Native peoples as partners. And that's the difference, right? When we talk about the relationship that the French had with Native peoples, the French gave them guns, ammunition, knives, hatchets, axes, but they also gave them clothes, like not clothes, but cloth, different types of fabric. They also brought in blankets, beads, mirrors, paint, and brought all of those into the Wichita and the Osage, as well as the Apache. And the Wichita and the affiliated tribes loved this stuff because it was new things for them to trade. And it gave them a new position of dominance, right? And in the meantime, the Wichita and the Osage gave the French exactly what they want, which was hides of buffalo and deer. One of the things that you have to remember is that the French are here to trade fur. The fur trade is what the French want to dominate. So they're giving them fur, the hides of buffalo, hides of deer. They're also providing the French with other animals, such as horses. They're also providing the French with Indian captives. And the Indian captives were essentially taken during times of war. And these Indian captives were supposed to help guide these French along and be useful as translators, be useful as guides, and that sort of thing. What ends up happening is the Wichita and the Osage become super dependent on trade, um, to the point where they started fighting for horses, fighting specifically for captives, so the meaning of war is going to change for them. The meaning of trade is going to change for them. They become much more dependent on trade, right? Um, and hunting is going to change. They're going to start over hunting quite a bit. Um, so Deer Creek is going to become really important here. Deer Creek specifically was a Wichita village, and it was a village that served as headquarters for roughly 30 to 40 Frenchmen. These were men who were actually professional hunters who supplied the entire region of Louisiana with meat. So I'm going to show you a map of, well, before I do that, I'm going to show you on the next slide what Louisiana looked like. So don't think of the state of Louisiana. Think essentially of what will be the Louisiana Purchase, that gigantic section of the middle part of the United States. So they provided the entire section of the middle part of the present day of the United States with meat. So the villagers who lived in Deer Creek provided these 30 to 40 men work. So they worked for these men, worked for them as whatever they needed. And they were paid with European merchandise. So Deer Creek becomes almost like this center where, so these men would go out hunting and they'd come back with everything they had successfully hunted and killed, and everyone who lived in the village processed what they hunted. So Deer Creek is essentially this hub for trade, the hub for where the hunting all was processed. And essentially, Deer Creek would evolve into becoming or into hosting an early stockyard and meat processing plant where the Wichita tribe would work as laborers. And this sort of thing would continue until the 1750s when the villagers would join other Wichitas and would essentially resettle along the Red River. And essentially, what ends up happening is eventually, there's going to be a huge war between the Wichita and the Osage. There's going to be a huge rivalry that develops between the two tribes. They'll fight over trade, they'll fight over access to horses and to guns. The Osage will constantly raid the Wichita village, and the Osage have better guns anyway. Meanwhile, the Wichita just want a stable supply of trade goods, and that sort of thing. So what ends up happening is the French, while they come in for all of this trade goods for their own benefit, it disrupts the native way of life and all of this alliance that had been established. And so it creates an animosity between or amongst these tribes. That leads me to the establishment of the Twin Villages. So when we talk about the Twin Villages, on either side of the Red River, so the Red River, of course, is the southern boundary of present-day Oklahoma, there are Wichita villages at this point on either side of the Red River. And there is a battle that takes place, and so on the left side of the slide here, you can see a depiction of what takes place. There is a battle that takes place between one side of the Red River and the other. So there are on one side uh, of the Red River, there are Wichita and Comanche allies that launch a raid against Apache villages in Texas. And the Apache villages are attacked because they have better guns, and they have a lot of guns. Um, the reason why this particular attack is important is because it leads to a larger fight. And the larger fight is a fight between Spain and France. Um, Spain had been trying to regain some control and influence in the Western Hemisphere anyway, so there had been quite a bit of tension, right? And so you can see in this map what French Louisiana looks like here. But Spain had been trying to gain some of that control and influence back. But what's going on is that England and France were already under quite a bit of tension also. And so what ends up happening is that tension showed that France was actually losing quite a bit of control. What ends up happening is we are now getting into this place of France losing control in Europe, France losing control in the Western Hemisphere. So in terms of the timeline, here's where we are. So in the 1750s, that's when you start to see the Wichitas moving to the Red River. And by 1763, you have the French and Indian War, which we'll talk about a little later. And in 1763, when the French and Indian War is over, France withdraws completely from North America, and all of their claims west of the Mississippi River are surrendered, and they are surrendered to Spain. Now, what makes this significant, besides the fact that that's surrendered to Spain, is that by that point, they had had control of Spain for 150 years, right? One of the things that you have to understand is that from 1763 until 1800, let me go back for a second. I can't do it. So from up till 1763, the French had control over this central part. And then from 1763 to 1800, Spain will have control over it. And then France takes control over it again in 1800 under the Treaty of San Ildefonso. Spain returns Louisiana in 1800 thanks to a guy named Napoleon. And so what ends up happening is there's this back and forth. French control, Spanish control, French control, Spanish control. It goes back and forth. And in the middle of all of that, you have these native peoples who are then fighting each other over control for trade and over control of status, right? Because the Spanish and the French have exposed them to horses and guns and, the back and the forth, right? This is the problem. So now you've got a situation where it's this constant battle of ultimately the question of who's in charge. Well, when we get to Napoleon, hopefully you guys will remember this from world history. If not, it's okay. Napoleon, being Napoleon, uh, has his own issues, and in 1800 he regains French Louisiana, and that only lasts for 3 years. In comes the election of 1800. And in the election of 1800, with the United States, you have this revolution of a political revolution, mind you, with the huge victory of Thomas Jefferson. The reason why it's such a significant victory is because for the first time in American history, you have someone of a different party winning the presidency. And in 1803, when it seems that there is a possibility, a wavering, so to speak, in Napoleon's bank account of him needing some money, Jefferson decides to bypass Congress and pursue this possibility of purchasing French Louisiana. So when we talk about his logic here, he's looking at French Louisiana, and it is 830,000 square miles of land. Jefferson is very much of the mindset that the United States is going to be a country for the regular farmer, because he himself is convinced that he is a regular farmer. He is not, and never has been a regular farmer. He is incredibly, he's just beyond, he's not a regular farmer. He's never been a regular farmer, ever. Even though he's nearly bankrupt a couple of times. In fact, he was bankrupt once. He's not your everyday farmer, but he's convinced that the economy of the United States will be an agricultural economy. And so in nearly doubling the landmass of the United States, he fully believes that he is giving the American people the opportunity to truly pursue this dream of fortifying the agricultural economy. And not only that, but he says that this right here is the beginning of a great American empire. Just buying all of this land. So when we talk about this whole idea of pursuing 830,000 square miles for $15 million, at that point, Congress thinks it's the most idiotic purchase ever. It's actually an amazing deal, right? It's quite a purchase. In fact, what you are looking at is a depiction of the signing of the papers that takes place in New Orleans, actually, that makes the deal final. But when we talk about what finalizes it, or what really sets it in motion, it's not really signing the papers for Jefferson. What Jefferson is, to his credit, is a student. It wasn't enough that we got the land. Jefferson says, I want to know what it has. I want to know what we've just gained. And so what he asks Congress to authorize is a series of scientific expeditions. And in those scientific expeditions, he authorizes a series of diplomatic expeditions. And it's important that you note that these are not just scientific expeditions. These are diplomatic expeditions, and we're going to talk about that in a later lecture. These are not just scientific expeditions, these are diplomatic expeditions. So, in these expeditions that Congress will authorize, it was important to know what the land had, what the land was like, do studies of the plants, studies of the animals, what is the weather like, the climate, what can you plant there, what grew there, what are the seasons like, but also talk to the people there, and the people there are going to be native people. So of course the most famous expedition of them all is the Lewis and Clark journey, right? So when we talk about the Lewis and Clark journey, the reason why it's the most famous is because it's the one that takes the most amount of time, and it's from 1804 to 1806. So I want to explain how this all comes about. First of all, let me go back a step and just explain how they did decide to divide this up. So Louisiana is obviously a massive amount of land. So they decide to divide up the territory into two halves. The northern half of the territory would be known as Louisiana. The southern half of the territory would be known as Orleans. Northern Louisiana eventually, in 1812, northern Louisiana would be known as Missouri Territory. That's in 1812. The southern half, which Oklahoma would be a part of, the southern half of the territory would be known as Arkansas Territory, and that would be in 1819. So 1812, it would be Missouri Territory. 1819, it would be known as Arkansas Territory. So they divided between, north and south. And when we talk about all of this stuff and what's involved here, and how it all sort of evolves, I want to start with how we get here. So in 1804, it's of course called the Corps of Discovery. 50 people leave St. Louis. So you'll see that on the map here. Let me see if I can highlight this for you in a different color. So there's St. Louis. So St. Louis is known, of course, as the gateway to the West. There's a specific reason why St. Louis is going to be really significant. So St. Louis, known as the gateway to the West, St. Louis is their starting point. They 50 people start at St. Louis and then go up the Missouri River, as you can see there. And in 1805, that's when Congress officially decides to divide Louisiana into the two territories. So initially, when we talk about Oklahoma, the Louisiana Territory is at first, Oklahoma is going to be under Louisiana jurisdiction, but then it becomes too much, because you'll notice how massive it is. It's just too much. One of the things that you'll see eventually is that, they realize how big it is, but only as they go. They don't realize how big it is until they're making the trip. Like, for example, Lewis and Clark, as they're making their trip, these two guys are, of course, writing in their diaries about their journey. The goal was to get to the western point of the country, right? The furthest western point of the country. So when they get to the western point of what's highlighted in pink there, they're thinking, okay, this is it, right? It's over. So they get to the western point of the Rocky Mountains, actually. They get to the western point of that, and they get to the highest point, and they're like, okay, this is it. That's it. It's done. When they look over the mountains and they see more land, they cannot believe that there's still more land to go. They're incredibly frustrated and just really disappointed. So I mean, they're literally learning as they go, right? This is the thing with the Louisiana Purchase. Um, and that's a part of what's going on with these expeditions. Um, so essentially, what he wanted was to um, start here at this point in Louisiana and go up the river and follow along the border of what would be Oklahoma and just find out what's going. So Jefferson, the goal was to follow the Red River to explore the Twin Villages and then make the trip. What Jefferson says, hey, go explore the Red River, and then, mess around with the Twin Villages, meet with the people there, and see if you can meet with them. And once you meet with them, then go overland and get to the Rocky Mountains, and you know, you can be fine. It'll be fine. It's a lot. I mean, it's a tremendous amount that Jefferson's asking him to do. He sends Sparks with 24 soldiers and some canoes, a group of canoes. He barely makes it into Oklahoma, primarily because he runs into a Spanish cavalry unit that was made up of several hundred men. And these men, overran Sparks's camp and sent Sparks home and said, if you don't go back to American settlements, you're going to be arrested, you're going to be a prisoner of war, and, well, you're not going to enjoy your time with us. So it did not turn out well for Richard Sparks. So Jefferson was under some bad uh, instructions. It did not go well for Richard Sparks. And this So here is St. Louis, right? And when we talk about, there's that launching point. So when we go to St. Louis, he decides to explore all the way around. So if you follow these red dots, it'll show you all the different ways that he's going. He goes up the Missouri River, and the reason why he goes through that area is because he really wants to meet with the Osage. And the Osage, of course, by that point are really significant because they had dominated that region. So you can't go into that area without meeting them. And you kind of want to make sure that you got a good feel for them, right? You want to make sure that you know who they are, but they also know who you are. And so he meets with the Osage villages, and from them, he got horses. He successfully avoided Spanish patrols. And then from there, he went west to the Rocky Mountains. And that's how you get Pikes Peak. He climbed that mountain, which is now named for him. He is also, or one of the things that you also need to know is Wilkinson, who is significant to our lecture, is the guy who broke off from Pike's, route. So Wilkinson is actually significant because he is a botanist. So when we talk about why Wilkinson matters, Wilkinson's not a botanist. Wilkinson what actually is significant because when Wilkinson joined up on the expedition, he traveled down the Arkansas River. That's what I meant to say. I don't know why I said he was a botanist. Wilkinson actually traveled down the Arkansas River. And you can actually see that sort of in the center of the map there. So November, December 1806, he traveled down the Arkansas River. And there, when we talk about his adventures there in 1806, he reached northeastern K County just as winter hit. And by then, the rivers had frozen over, and of course, snowstorms had limited his visibility. So he lost his food supply, he lost his ammunition. He and his men suffered from severe frostbite. They actually came across Osage hunters who helped them with food supplies and gave them clothing. And Wilkinson is actually significant to Oklahoma history because he would actually serve briefly as governor of this particular Louisiana territory. In terms of territorial government, he would serve as a governor. So Wilkinson is actually pretty important. He is someone who is seen as a trusted figure, not just among American officials, but also among Native officials. So that's pretty important too. Okay, so let's talk about other expeditions to come. When we talk about the Sibley expedition, this man pictured at the left, the portrait on the left is George Sibley. So Sibley is important because what he realized is that here in this particular region, specifically Oklahoma, there was a lot of salt. So salt is a major commodity on the frontier for meat preservation and obviously for food seasoning. So Sibley actually is not a military officer. He would become a sub-agent at what would be Fort Osage. And so Sibley was a guy who is essentially a middle ground sort of person. He would essentially communicate on behalf of the United States to the Osage tribe. And the Osage actually trusted him to communicate with the Americans. And then, of course, there's Major Stephen Long, who's there on the right-hand side. He's a part of the Long Bell expedition of 1820. Of all of the military expeditions, this is the expedition that yielded the most information. But let me just say, that is entirely by accident. So that was so here's what ends up happening. Stephen Long was a major in the Corps of Topographical Engineers, and he was trying to find the sources of the Red River and the Arkansas River. And so he was working with Captain John Bell, and John Bell had been sent down the Arkansas River. John Bell didn't go by himself. He went with 12 men, and he continued south to the headwaters of the Red River. And he ran into the same problem that James Wilkinson did, 14 years before that. So Wilkinson, remember, had timed it really poorly, ended up in the dead of winter, ended up in the dead of winter and nearly froze to death and, with his fingers falling off. But the problem with Bell is that Bell's timing was bad because he went in the insane heat. He arrived in Oklahoma in mid-August, and you guys know what Oklahoma is like in August. So it's 90-degree temperatures, and these guys are wearing uniforms that are head to toe covered with their stupid hats. And we are not talking about light fabric. We're not talking about, breathable fabric either. Everything is very heavy material. So they're exhausted, they're sweating, and they don't have enough food. So these guys are living off of skunks because that's all they could find to kill. There are stories of how they killed fawns that were literally taken from the jaws of a wolf. They killed hawks, they killed turkeys, they ate turtles, boiled corn, and once again, just like Wilkinson, they had to rely on the Osage for help. So September rolls around, September 10th, 1820. Stephen Long and his party arrived at the Arkansas River only to realize they weren't. They were actually at the wrong river. They actually ended up at the Canadian River. Um, so these guys are all at the wrong place. Essentially, everybody ends up at the wrong place. So John Bell was supposed to go down. It goes down the Arkansas and makes it down to the Red River, which was fine, but they timed it really bad. Long was supposed to go to, supposed to get down to the Arkansas, ends up on the Canadian, and accidentally comes up with all of this incredibly important scientific data on Oklahoma. Now, the most important scientific information that he comes up with is that the Southern Plains were generally a very sandy wasteland that had been unsuitable for general agriculture. Um, and so what Stephen Long says is, listen, this place is a desert. And in fact, he calls it the Great American Desert. And that is really problematic, right? Because how do you sell an area that was supposed to be a part of Jefferson's great vision of the agricultural economy when Stephen Long just said this is the Great American Desert? That's where a guy named Thomas Nuttall comes in. So you spell his last name Nuttall, Thomas Nuttall. He's the father of Western American botany. So he spent several months in 1819 collecting samples, botanical samples in the area. And essentially, he is one of these guys who, what's interesting about Nuttall is, you know, he has an entirely different experience from Stephen Long. He says, listen, there are there is an incredible amount that you can gain and learn from this area. In fact, he says, quote, nothing could at this season exceed the beauty of these plains. He's fascinated by what was growing and what was living on the plains in 1819 and 1820. What's interesting is that Nuttall had joined William Bradford and a company of riflemen, and essentially what they were doing was ejecting white squatters from Osage land. There had been 200 families squatting near the mouth of Kiamichi, and they had planted these fields of corn, cotton, and wheat. And he says, he being Thomas Nuttall, he says these people were the worst moral character imaginable, being many of them renegades from justice, and such as have forfeited the esteem of civilized society. I mention all of this because it is a preview of what is to come. That is a preview of what is to come. The fact that they had spent all of that time getting rid of these people who had the audacity to believe that they could just show up and just live there because Indians were living there. Uncivilized Indians were living there. Um, he writes this wonderful quote, and it becomes almost a prediction of what's to come, right? And that's the kicker. You start to see more of this sort of push for how can we profit from what's to come? Because you'll notice that the people who were squatting there had yielded, you know, or made quite a bit of money. They could make about $3.50 per bushel, uh, depending on what they made or what they produced, right? Which is quite a bit of money in the 1800s. And so you start to see a lot of commercial explorers, a lot of particularly Red River traders. And so I want to talk about a few of these people. So Anthony Glass, who got permission from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Glass and 10 other men left, an area in Mississippi. This is in July of 1808, to participate in a trade fair with the Wichita and with all of the Southern Plains tribes. And he showed up in the Twin Villages. So this is going to be, right around the Red River area. Showed up in the Twin Villages and presented the greetings of the President of the United States and his desire to trade with them and their Comanche allies. So Anthony Glass shows up basically as almost as if he were a representative of the United States or a diplomat on behalf of the United States, and basically says, listen, I'm coming with representation, with the blessings of the president. And he ends up staying in the area for 6 months. And he would report to Sibley about the Wichita's cultural habits. He tells Sibley, listen, the Wichita are people who are constantly under siege, who are essentially held as captives in their own village by the Osage, so the Osage really hold the power here, right? So he's working for the government, but he's also working for his own profit. Then there's the Three Forks area. So Three Forks, and I've got the asterisk there for a reason. Three Forks is essentially a trading post. It is where the three major rivers meet. It's the Arkansas, Verdigris, and Grand Rivers merge just north of Muskogee. So the Arkansas band of the Osage had resided here after they had driven away the Wichita in the 1760s. So once the Americans show up, you have the arrival of the Chouteau brothers. The Chouteau brothers, let me spell that for you. It's Chouteau. The Chouteau brothers. Chouteau. The Chouteau brothers. Their names are Pierre and Auguste. Pierre and Auguste Chouteau. They had made a fortune trading with the Osage along the Missouri River. And then they lost the monopoly of that trade, which had been granted to them by the Spanish. So they decided, okay, we've lost all our money. We've got to start all over again. So they moved. They decided that they're going to just relocate and move to um, the, the 3,000 Osage members that live, further south. And um, essentially, Pierre's son, um, who became a colonel at West Point, opens up this new trading post and I mean, listen, just so you understand what a quality guy this guy is, he had just completed a prison term in Mexico because he brought trade goods across the plains, across the border into Santa Fe without Spanish authorization. Um, he was fluent in Osage, though. He was the husband of two or more, that's the quote, two or more Osage women. Um, so this was a family, essentially, a family business of trade. And they knew how to trade with the Osage. They knew how to make their money. And this Colonel A.P. Shoto was what his name was. By 1824, he had shipped 38,000 pounds of furs to New Orleans markets. 38,000 pounds of furs to New Orleans markets. Now, by 1831, it would only be 14,684 pounds. And the reason why was because they had been overhunting. And so game had become scarce. But it's sort of indicative of how big and how competitive Three Forks had become, because the Shoto Brothers Trading was not the only trade game in town. There's Joseph Bogie, Bogy. Joseph Bogie was a Frenchman who operated trading establishments in Illinois and in Arkansas. He traded extensively with the Osage. There's Nathaniel Pryor, Pryor. Pryor went bankrupt in Virginia. He moved to Three Forks and he opened an establishment there. He married an Osage woman. He learned the language and he won the confidence of the tribe. So he married into the tribe, learned their language. Because he learned their language, he learned their culture, he gained their confidence and their support. He wasn't really a successful merchant per se, but what he did do was he received an appointment as a sub-agent. And so what he did was he essentially worked as a middleman. And that's what gained him power and influence. Three Forks, as a trading post, becomes this huge hub, a huge hub of economic and diplomatic activity, right? Where even if you don't have a whole lot of money to make, you can gain power and influence there, as Pryor demonstrates, right? That's the key. For the sake of larger context issues, it's important for you to know that when we talk about the larger context in terms of international issues, Spain is really fearful of what the United States is going to do next, right? Spain has slowly but surely been losing control of things, right? They have long been losing control of colonies. And the United States is a little bit up and coming, not quickly, not in the sense that they have been, the United States has been becoming a great grand world power in any real sense, but Keep in mind, at this point, the United States has fought and won the War of 1812, which has defeated Great Britain for the second time, which means that's, the American Revolution Part Two, essentially. Um, and not only that, but it has also declared, a sense of, a real sense of, you know, uh, ownership and pushing itself towards a real identity, and trying to establish itself as a real um, coast to coast, or at least, yeah, on its way there, coast to coast country. And that makes Spain nervous. And so, in doing so, this treaty is an assurance to Spain that, okay, well, you guys are satisfied with this land, great. You guys keep that. We're going to keep everything south of that, and we'll be fine. But keep in mind, 2 years from now, in 1821, Mexico was going to claim its independence. And that's going to throw everything off. When Mexico claims its independence, that sends things into a bit of a free for all. What's going to happen is it's going to send things into a free for all because um, trade is going to change in places like Three Forks, where you'll have much more liberal trade policies that will allow more Americans to come into places like Santa Fe and the Rio Grande and settlements like that, and bring in trade. You're going to have Americans start to show up in places like, Texas, and trade there. And it's going to have a huge, huge impact on what all of that looks like in terms of issues of slavery. So you've got to think about how that shapes um, the next few decades, right? Because that is going to have an impact on upcoming issues of things like the future border of the nation, but also things like the Civil War. And so it's not just going to be trade, it's going to be international boundaries, it's going to be international identity, right? And right in the thick of things, of course, is the still non existent state of Oklahoma.